Good evening, everyone. Tonight, our speaker will be Vanessa Able, and the speech is titled, Wisdom from the Fountain, What Can Art Teach Us About Freedom? Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you, Bonnie. Hello, everybody. Good evening. So nice to see everyone. So tonight, indeed, I'll be talking about art, or a very particular aspect of art, and I'll be showing some images in a little while. I like to talk about art. I like to think about art because when I first discovered Zen, I was actually an art student at the time in London back in 2001. And I came to Zen with great energy and enthusiasm right from the start. And at the same time, I was very enthusiastic and energetic about the art that I was making and practicing and studying at school. And I don't think I was so aware at the time of the immense overlap between the two practices. I don't really think I put a lot of thought into why it was that I was so drawn to these two practices and how much they informed each other. But of course, as we all know, Zen it's very close to the art. It uses the arts and promotes the arts and engages with the arts in a way that perhaps other religions don't in quite the same way, or other sort of spiritual structures. Even from very early Zen traditions in China, back in the 7th, 8th centuries, we see the emergence of teaching poems when Zen teachers began to think in a more concise, perhaps metaphorical way about the imagery that they were putting forward to try and explain these things that were very difficult to put into words. So art at the service of Zen, as an expression of Zen, has always been a very useful thing. And recently, even in the last century, we've seen musicians like John Cage, Leonard Cohen, who've been very wedded to Buddhism and Zen, poets like Gary Snyder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and even painters who are more loosely connected, maybe like Mark Rothko or Jackson Pollock. And I think that very broadly, what art and Zen have in common is that they both offer us a sort of an intuitive, introspective, analytical, spontaneous, and very often humorous way of interacting with the world, and are both ultimately about uncovering and pursuing truth and freedom. So tonight I want to share one artist with you who has always been very close to my heart. He was never outed as a Zen practitioner. In fact, not at all. And the more I talk about him, the reasons will become obvious why. But in my view, he embodied so many of the principles that we practice here, and so many of the principles that I personally aspire to. He is someone for me who put forward the fundamental question: how can we be free? How can we express our reality and engage with reality in a way that is liberated from conditioning, from tradition, and even maybe from the imperatives of survival? So let me share this with you. Doing this right? Okay, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Does anybody know who this is? I don't know, I can't actually see everybody if anybody's putting up a hand right now. So this is, hang on, I'm just trying to, sorry, I've got several windows doing weird things. So this person here is Marcel Duchamp. He was a French artist who was mostly active in the first half of the 20th century. He was in Paris studying art during a very exciting time, which was the revolutionary cultural shift that we now know as modernism. And during this time, and this was like in the sort of 1910s onwards towards the start of the First World War, the arts were shifting into a much more intellectual and commercial realm than they ever had been before. The art market had really taken off, and painting went from something that happened as a sort of public or even private commission to a commodity that could be valued and traded. Galleries became a thing. And artists were beginning to sort of carve out a more intellectual foothold in public debate. And a lot of these debates were about the breakdown of assumptions about what art should be, what a painting should be, and what its function was. And it was a kind of conversation that led to paintings like this, for example, by Kazimir Malevich. And this is called Black Square. And this was a painting, for example, that completely broke down the idea that painting needed to be something representative. So painting could be something abstract. It could be about color. It could be about form. This was a very, very revolutionary idea back in the day. And at the same time, other movements were gaining momentum, like Cubism. So when Duchamp first moved to Paris, you would probably have had Picasso and Braque putting out some of their most seminal works. And they were deconstructing the traditions of painting as far as composition, realism, and perception were concerned. And for example, this would be one of Picasso's most famous paintings, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. This is the Demoiselle d'Avignon from about 1907, I think. So this is just a little tiny bit of background to give you some idea of what somebody like Marcel Duchamp would be coming into as a young man, as a young artist. He was very tickled by these iconoclastic principles of breaking the rules of painting and questioning, you know, what painting should be about. And he even tried his hand a few times at his own sort of cubist style of painting. So this is a painting by Marcel Duchamp, and it's called Nude Descending a Staircase. And he probably painted this about 5 years after the Demoiselle d'Avignon of Picasso. And if you sort of compare the two paintings, you can see that he's kind of entering into this cubist style, but he's putting his own little spin on it, in as much as this kind of painting is, even though it's broken down and it's far more abstracted, there's a lot of movement in this painting, which was something that the cubists were not doing. And it's something that Marcel Duchamp was very interested in. And the nude is, you know, it's extremely abstracted and almost machine-like, as you see this kind of, you know, this movement of this form coming down a staircase. And if you look closely, you can even see there's these little sort of cartoon-like swishes that are kind of meant to stand for movement itself. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's a little bit kind of entertaining the cubist idea, but taking it to another level, which the cubists themselves weren't particularly impressed with or didn't really appreciate. I think they just felt a little mocked. But still, it got him known. It brought him attention. And he sort of began to cultivate a bit of a reputation for himself as you know, somebody who was quite contrary to the sort of elitist echelons of the art world. One of the main complaints about the contemporary art world today that I think people have is that it can feel very elitist. even today, and quite opaque in ways that make it difficult for people to engage with it. I know that it's one of the reasons why I myself decided, after I finished my master's in London, to cease making art altogether and to engage with another medium, writing, which I felt to be far more direct and communicative. And indeed, in 1915, Duchamp was kind of beginning to feel the same way. He felt that the art world was constricted and a regulated kind of boys' club. And this attitude, which was coupled with this commercialization of art that placed pressure on artists in all the wrong places, he did not think it was helpful in the matter that he thought was the most vital as far as art was concerned, and that was freedom and the pursuit of truth. So our man moved to New York, and he made it known that he'd given up painting. He found the medium to be too caught up in tradition and rules. And instead, he started to think about how else one could express oneself. An artist, in his view, was more than a craftsman. So what could an artist do? What did it mean to be an artist? So around that time, he started to collect a few choice objects that he called ready-mades, which he proposed as ready-made pieces of art. And so this would be one of them. This is a bottle rack that he just purchased at a hardware store because he liked it. He found it interesting. It caught his attention. He brought it home, he signed it, he dated it, and he kind of left it in his studio to percolate. And then, just to show you a few more examples, this was a snow shovel taken in a similar spirit. And you can see right here is where he signed it and dated it again. And then this one, bicycle wheel, which actually I think was his first one. And he mostly kept them quiet at first. He kept them sort of in his studio, in his house, wasn't quite sure what they were or what he was going to do to them. And then he sort of quietly began to place some items in various art exhibitions. He had some other ones I don't have images of. That one was a hat rack that would go on the wall, and it kind of looked a bit like a sort of an octopus that he suspended from the ceiling. And another was like a coat rack that he stuck to the floor. And particularly the hat rack and the coat rack, he would place them somewhere near the entrance of a gallery, and people just wouldn't notice them. They would walk past them and not pay them any attention at all. Or if their attention was brought to them for whatever reason, they were utterly perplexed because in 1915, if you walked into an art gallery, I mean, you're used to it today. You're used to walking into an art gallery and possibly being surprised and confounded by something that you see. But in 1915, you expect to see a painting hanging on the wall, a drawing, an etching, or perhaps a figurative sculpture. So the situation he was creating, he was an artist who was not making the thing that he called art. Rather, he was appropriating something that had already been made. And to boot, these items were based. They were purely utilitarian objects with no higher aesthetic value. So in some ways, because of this, they were part of his reaction towards this objection he had to the commercialization of art. He once said, a spiritual approach to art a spiritual approach to art making is obviated by the money value of the paintings. The way of getting out of the exchangeability of art objects. If you could go to the store and buy a bicycle wheel for $10, or why would you want to spend $10,000 on one, exactly the same one from an art gallery? It just made no sense. So it really turned it on its head. And he was frequently insistent that the ready-mades had nothing to do with taste. So the taste didn't play a part in how he chose these objects, because taste was a fleeting thing, he argued. In presenting the ready-mades, he was looking to tap into something much more timeless, much more persistent. So these ready-mades to me are a lot like koans, or they take on a lot of the function of poetry, because they're sort of beyond language, but they're not beyond their own set of meanings. So they're taken out of their original context and they're represented in another context and given a different name. So like the snow shovel, for example, he gave the title In Advance of a Broken Arm, you know, which means it's completely nonsensical, but it's just another way of recontextualizing the object. So we're being asked for the first time, like possibly in your life, to consider an object that you've never really considered in this way before, like the snow shovel, at a particular place in a particular moment of time. So normally a snow shovel is something that you'd pick up and you'd go and dig the snow with it. You would use your body instead of using your mind, which is what you're being invited to do. And engagement with objects in this way, this kind of like recalibration of our relationship with objects, is something that for those of us who study Zen and practice Zen, it's something quite familiar. Dongshan was a Zen master in Japan in the 9th century. You know him as the author of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi that we chant. One of the questions that most intrigued Dongshan when he was a young monk was whether or not inanimate objects were able to expound the Dharma. And when Dongshan asked his teachers this question, teachers plural, he was persistent. The teacher, or at least one of his teachers, responded by holding up a fly whisk. That was his response. Do inanimate objects expound the Dharma? He held up a fly whisk. And that question and the answer that it elicited was representative of a shift that was occurring at the time as Buddhism was merging with Chinese philosophy, when nature and objects became integrated as a part of the spiritual discourse. So now it's something that we're very used to seeing. You know, we're used to reading Zen poems about blades of grass and herons in the moonlight. And this is a koan, Dongshan's question. So it's not something that has a direct or understandable meaning. And it's a gesture that, in fact, is liberating itself from the usual boundaries of meaning and language. I think the surrealists would have loved the gesture of the fly whisk. And I'm sure Duchamp would have loved it too. So Zen has this habit of breaking up the highbrow with the lowbrow and vice versa, and responding to the sophisticated with the mundane, right? So if I ask a profound question about Buddha nature and my teacher holds up a fly whisk, so the parameters of my question come tumbling down, as does the very assumption of a question in the first place. And so Duchamp was interested in doing something like this with his objects, with his ready-mades. In a gallery, you go in and you expect to see art. You don't expect to see a snow shovel or a coat rack. And so your expectations are undermined and your parameters are reset. And this is seeing with new eyes. So this is Duchamp's most famous ready-made. And it was the first one that he exhibited publicly in a very calculated manner. So it was 1917, he was living in New York, and there was this exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists. And it was a huge show, anybody could enter. The only stipulation was that you had to pay a $6 entrance fee, application fee for your piece of art. And Duchamp was actually on the board for the show. So when the exhibits were being hung, he had this kind of insider entry. As the spaces were being allotted for the pieces, he went down to the hardware store and bought this urinal He signed it with a fake signature, and the signature that he used is R. Mutt. And he submitted it for display under the title, The Fountain. So this did not go down well at all. Like, it didn't, the Fountain did not even make the show's opening. It was immediately pulled from the exhibition on grounds of its vulgarity and the fact that it was not an original art object. It had not been made by an artist. And by doing this, of course, the curators of the show had played right into Duchamp's hands. This is exactly what I think he hoped would happen, because then, as a gesture of protest, he resigned from the board of the show, protesting against the censorship of the curators. And it caused a stir. The news trickled down to the newspapers and the art journals. And meanwhile, Man Ray, the photographer, Man Ray, who was a very close friend of Duchamp's, he took possession of the urinal and brought it to his studio, where he took this picture of it that you're looking at now. So this was really a mic drop moment for Duchamp. Although the fountain was not shown in the exhibition he had intended, the ripples of what he did extended out into the world and just kept amplifying over time. And decades, and even now, even a century later, this ready-made, like this urinal, this fountain, is in some ways seen as the last word, or at least one of the strongest words in the discussion about the artist as some kind of genius or unique innovator. And it reminded me of something recently at Cannondale. We've had a beautiful painting donated to us. And once it was donated, we've been having a conversation about where to hang it. And one of the venues that was suggested was the bathroom. And there was discussion, and the suggestion was shelved with the concern that hanging it in the bathroom might be possibly offensive to the artist. And of course, we're not hoping to offend anybody or insult anybody, but we are in the business of examining our presumptions. According to, in Zen teachings, the bathroom is a place for practice just as much as anywhere else. In Zen monasteries, there's a whole form associated with washing and using the toilet. And there's an essay that I really love. It's not a Zen essay, but it's by a Japanese author called Junchiro Tanizaki. It was written in 1933. It's called In Praise of Shadows, and it's all about toilets and how wonderful toilets are, and what a wonderful, deeply spiritual time you can have in the bathroom. And this is a quote from the essay. "The Japanese toilet truly is a place of spiritual repose. It always stands apart from the main building at the end of a corridor, in a grove fragrant with leaves and moss. No words can describe that sensation as one sits in the dim light, basking in the faint glow reflected from the shoji, lost in meditation or gazing out at the garden. The novelist Natsume Soseki counted his morning trips to the toilet a great pleasure, a physiological delight, he called it." So, I mean, bathrooms are a place of repose. And the question is, could we turn them into spaces of contemplation for ourselves? Many of us like to read in the bathroom. I used to stick study sheets up on the walls of my toilet at home, or poems that I wanted to read and reread. And I'm not a man, but I can imagine that the urinal, an object that you directly face so many times in one lifetime, could be also an object of deep contemplation. It's a urinal, but is there a beauty to its shiny white enameled surface and those curvaceous forms? Can anyone see, like I can, the shape of the Buddha or the seated Virgin in the shadows of the interior? And how about the name, the fountain of youth, the fountain of wisdom, the fountain that keeps giving, that washes away, but is also a recipient, the fountain that accepts and takes away. Like I mentioned, so Duchamp always denied that his choice of ready-mades was based on any aesthetic or symbolic connotation. And yet I can't help but make these connections and draw these conclusions in my mind. And it's the same with the bicycle wheel. So if I look at the bicycle wheel, I could see the wheel of Dharma. I could see Emperor Ashoka's wheel that became the symbol of Buddhism 2000 years ago in India. I think the point that he was trying to make is that we don't know really what his intention was, we'll never know what the artist's intention is. And does that matter? Because taste, aesthetics are floating and relative, and signifiers are floating and relative, and they always change with time and context. So the fountain that's here on my Zoom screen that I'm presenting during a Dharma talk cannot have the same impact and meaning as it did to someone who was viewing it in New York in a group show in the middle of the First World War. It has no inherent meaning. The magic and the dynamism of this artwork comes from the situation in which it's viewed, and that keeps changing time and time again. Understanding this and being able to engage in this way is liberation, and hence the mic drop. Because Duchamp only made about 10 ready-mades in his whole life. So he realized that if he made too many, it would lose its impact and it would lose its meaning. And what he said was that he had said everything that he felt needed to be said, and that if he was to continue, he would only be repeating himself. So he decided to stop making art altogether in a public sense. And at the time, he was just 30 years old. So he was pretty young. And one of the things he was concerned with in his life, and then something that he was critical of in the world at large, was excess and needless activity. So he only produced those 10 ready-mades because more would have been too many. And this is another one of my big takeaways from Marcel Duchamp. As someone who works as a self-employed, creative type person, the issue of productivity is always at the forefront for me. I'm always compelled, like, to feel like I have to keep working, I have to keep producing, and that production, that ongoing production, is somehow like deeply connected with my value as an individual and a useful, sort of responsible member of society. I think there's a pathology of production in our culture, in our society, and I think it was already manifest a century ago. I think it's what Duchamp was commenting upon when he decided to be deliberately frugal with his activity. Because after all, what drives our sense of productivity? Is there enough space in this world to accommodate all the things that every individual wants to produce or thinks they want to produce? Working in order to obtain the things we need to live is one thing, but where do we draw that line with ourselves? How much is enough? So I think it takes great courage and confidence to know when to stop. And this was part of Duchamp's sensibility as an artist and as a human. Instead of making art, he took up chess and spent the next years of his life studying chess intensely and playing it to championship level, like international championship level. He saw chess as an art form. And he once said that not every artist is a chess player, but every chess player is an artist. So there's two more works of his that I would just like to present to you this evening before I finish up. So I mentioned that he stopped making art publicly at the age of 30. And then he lived about another 50 or so years, and he produced 2 more major works during that time. But he produced them secretly, so nobody knew that he was doing these things. So the first one, let me bring up the slide for you. So the first one is called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, Even. Another very difficult title. It's more commonly known as The Large Glass. And that glass, it's hard to tell from this picture, but it's about 8 feet high. It's pretty big. This took him about a decade to make. He wanted to make a painting that was not a painting, so he used glass instead of canvas. And he spent a long time developing the forms that interrelate to one another within that plane of the glass. And we don't have the time this evening, and it would far exceed my knowledge of this piece to actually go to explain any more than that I've just explained. But what interests me about this work is how he made it. You know, it took 10 years. He sort of just fiddled with it. You know, while he was working to become the French chess champion, he would go into his studio for a couple of hours a day and sort of melt some lead, or, you know, do some drawing, figure out something technical that he needed to do. And I'll just show you some, these are just some drawings and just some ideas of how much detail and how much kind of like symbolic meaning there is in all of this. And I think a lot of it is probably quite tongue-in-cheek too, but it's called The Bride. The Bride, there's an image of a bride up here, and then you have her bachelors down here, and sort of lots of mechanical motifs that keep repeating through other artworks, earlier artworks of his. And then we have this picture, which I love. So this picture was taken by Man Ray. Man Ray came to visit Marcel Duchamp in his studio one day, and he found that he had left one of the panes of the large glass horizontal on a surface for more than a year. So what you're looking at is all the dust that collected on the painting for a year. He just didn't touch it. He just let dust fall on it because he wanted the dust to be part of the painting. So Man Ray came and took this incredible painting, which sort of looks a bit like you could even be looking out of an airplane window or something. And then after the picture was taken, Duchamp cleaned all of it with the exception of the little, the little cones. If you can see these cones here at the bottom, so that's where the dust stayed. And he sealed the dust in there with like a kind of a liquid cement. And he was just thrilled at this idea of having part of this painting have been created just by dust, just by time. It was evidence of time and evidence of his own patience. It was really wonderful. And then what happened after 10 years, he kind of figured like he was done with it. It wasn't really finished, but he didn't feel like he could do anything else to it. And the large glass went off for an exhibition in Brooklyn. And during that exhibition, it was bought by a collector, and it was being shipped to the collector's house. And en route to being shipped to the collector's house, it smashed. The whole thing just cracked into many, hundreds of pieces. And the collector was absolutely distraught. You can see it here. And she called him, and she was beside herself. And he sort of, according to, in keeping with his character, was at least equanimous. And actually, he later reported quite delighted by what had happened, because he felt that this crack that occurred in the painting was just something that it was a kind of finish to it, and something that he never could have done himself. It was chance, it was fate. It was another universal force at play. And he went over to this collector's house with his tube of super glue or whatever you use to fix glass, and he manually just stuck all these little pieces together and repaired it. So this piece is housed in the Museum of Art in Philadelphia. So if anybody is ever in the area, do go and see it, because it's wonderful. The piece the one that I showed you before is a copy. There's a couple of copies in the world. This one's in London. But this is the original, and it's the most wonderful with all those cracks in it. So finally, the last piece. So this large glass took about 10 years. And then there was one more piece, the final piece that he made in his life. And he worked on this piece for the last 20 years of his life, pretty much exclusively. Nobody really knew about it until after he died. and he left instructions for it to be reconstructed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art after he died. So he passed away in 1968, and in 1969, this art piece was put together in Philadelphia. So when you go there to look at his last artwork, this is what you see. You see this doorway, it's like an old barn door. And you get closer and you see that there's two little peepholes in the door, and you approach the peepholes and you look inside, and this is what you see. So the painter Jasper Johns said at the time that this was the strangest work of art any museum has ever had in it. And probably he said this in the 60s, and I'm sure it's been topped since then, but really at the time, this was very shocking. Not even just so much for the image, but in the context of everything Duchamp had and had not been doing for the last 6 decades. It was very, very surprising. So what this is, what you're looking at is a kind of a 3-dimensional mise-en-scène of a woman lying in the grass, and you're looking at from a very intimate angle, obviously. And it's a complete mystery. You don't know, is this woman sleeping? Is she dead? Has she been violated? Is she blissful? Is she post-coital? Looking through the holes, you're just consigned to your one particular viewpoint. And you immediately feel yourself, you find yourself wanting to see more. To some people it's beautiful, to some people it's shocking, to some people it's erotic. Who is this woman? You can't see her face. All that you can see is that she's holding a lamp in her hand, and that there's a waterfall glistening in the background against the landscape behind her. I don't know how well you can see that. You probably can't see that in the picture that I'm showing, but it's just here. And he actually set up these little lights. So it actually kind of glistens a little bit in a kind of 60s sort of way. So what is going on? He gave a title. I think he gave a big clue with the title of the piece. He called it Given, number 1, the waterfall. Number 2, the illuminating gas. This was a shocking piece of art. I'll admit that I found it shocking too, but not for reasons of eroticism or sexuality. I think what shocked me here was the sincerity of an expression of something like beauty. The origin of the world, which is it's a reference to another painting by Gustave Courbet of the female genitals, exposed and beautiful and placed in nature with the 2 most essential elements, light and water, which are also 2 such rich spiritual metaphors. And the woman, who's this sexual, beautiful creature, herself the source of creation, she's holding a light, but she's holding it in broad daylight. So it's the light within the light, or the illuminating light that he refers to in the title. So to me, this is an image of freedom, not just what it represents, but in what it implies about the full circle that Duchamp traveled in his life. The journey from the intellectual statements and gestures of his 20s to the secret inward work that persisted for the rest of his life. And in the end, he was able to bring together his perspective on the culture of contemporary art with a really sincere fundamental expression in this, what I think is a final ode to the world. It's a kind of a homecoming, or a return to the source, to the origin. So I'm going to leave it there. And if anybody has any questions or comments or startled reactions, please pour them forth. Thank you.
So for any questions, please come to Gasho, or you can raise your digital hand. We're all shocked into silence, Vanessa.
Knew that would happen. Dave.
So I'm curious if you could just say a little bit more about the ready-mades as an answer to the question of whether an inanimate object can express the Dharma.
I don't have my fly whisk here. I think, look, when you go into the koans and the stories with Dongshan in particular, the answer to the question is many layered. It's a completely different, it's a complete shift in perspective when you start to consider trees, objects around you, when you shift your attention in that way. And I think, you know, even now, I mean, we understand that trees, for example, plants have a great level of sentience, and in terms of communication with each other, and, you know, things that go on, there's communities and life and communication, and we talk about it in terms of oneness, in terms of emptiness, and in terms of interconnectedness, in the sense that we cannot draw the line between ourselves and the objects around us. I don't think that was I don't think that was necessarily the spirit with which Duchamp was putting out his ready-mades in that sense. But for me, they still provide a perspective shift. Like I'm in Maine right now, and my in-laws have got a couple of snow shovels in the garage. I've never had a snow shovel anywhere I've lived, because I've never lived anywhere where it snows. And I'm seeing these snow shovels, and I'm like, whoa, we should like bring them inside and hang them on the wall. They're beautiful. You know, I'm admiring these snow shovels. And I think, you know, by the same token, I mean, I'm in somebody else's house, and I'm always so curious. Like I see pictures on the walls, and you see objects that are put in places, like they're representative of decisions that have been made. In the bathroom, like just above the toilet here, there's a little picture of like a rocky outcrop with some fir trees on top. And I look at it every time I go in the bathroom, and part of me, I want to ask my family, my in-laws, you know, what it is and where it's from, but I kind of don't. You know, I sort of like, I really enjoy having putting my own meaning on it. And I know that if I hear a different story, it's going to take away a little bit of that. And it's a wonderful experience of art that is not aesthetic, and it has nothing to do with craft, which I'm not, by the way, I'm not demeaning. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. The mastery of art and craft, you know, in particular, and craftsmanship, it's a wonderful thing, but it's a different thing. I think what we're talking about here is the cognitive shift. So I have no idea if that answers your question, Dave.
Well, pretty much, yes. It was. I'm grateful for your thoughts on the question. The particular thing I was wondering about was whether you thought Duchamp was, if not consciously addressing that question from Zen, at least sort of on a very close parallel sort of plane.
I would say probably as close as you could get, given that he was not directly involved in that conversation. I think, I mean, it was part of a larger I'm not a scholar of the early 20th century, but you know, I know that there was a wider conversation going on, I think, about a lot of these things. He was definitely curious about metaphysics and various things, even though he was not a religious man. Yeah, thank you.
Nick?
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Vanessa. Thanks so much for the Dharma talk about exploring Zen and the arts. As a musician, I kind of felt like a kid in a candy shop hearing everything that you had to say tonight, so thank you for that. I wanted to acknowledge something really important that you said at the beginning of your talk, and it was, you said that while Zen and art informs each other, and oftentimes art is at the service of Zen, we have to remember that they're not exactly the same thing. And I've always been a little bit perplexed whenever someone meets me and they know that I'm a musician and that I also practice Zen. And usually the first thing that they say is, oh, you're a musician, so you already know a lot about Zen. And I'm not quite sure why they think it's the same thing. And in fact, my first Zen teacher who I started practicing with about 11, 12 years ago, she was actually trained as a concert pianist. And she had a really good reply whenever someone would approach like a musician or an artist and kind of make that assumption. And she would always ask them, does the way that you cook in the kitchen impact the way you drive on the road? So it's not really the same thing.
Right.
And I think while the arts and Zen have many shared veins that run between them, yeah, calling them the same thing, it's not quite accurate, I think. But something that I've always personally kind of held and reconciled what artists, musicians, poets, novelists do, I've kind of seen it as this is their unique individual expression of their Buddha nature. And by extension, people who are in the arts who have really crafted, you know, their skill to the highest level possible, they kind of have this gift of expressing all of our nature. And, you know, for example, you know, Monet can express his profound nature by painting water lilies, and Beethoven can express his profound nature by, you know, writing 9 symphonies, and Basho can express his nature by haikus, and Dostoevsky by writing Russian novels that go on forever. And I guess I was just kind of curious what your take on all this might be, because, you know, I'm coming at this from the point of view as a musician, but, you know, since you yourself are a writer and an artist and an art lover, I'm just curious if, you know, what your take on that might be.
So my take specifically on, like, on the relationship of Zen practice to art making, do you mean that, Nick?
Yeah, sure. Or you know, like I was saying, I've always kind of felt like that, like artists have this ability to express their Buddha nature in a very unique way. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, I think for, you know, people who are skilled and well practiced and sincere, it's, you know, it's not always the case, but I think, you know, when you see it, you know, when you connect with someone's work, whether it's poetry or music or the visual arts, you know, I think you, for me, for some reason, for me, I actually see it more in poetry. I guess maybe just because it's so much, it's a little more literal, but, and it's something that can kind of, for me at least, the words kind of stay in my head. But, you know, I mean, I mentioned Jackson Pollock, I mentioned like Mark Rothko, you know, I don't think either of those two people were necessarily Buddhists or, you know, Zen people. I don't want to appropriate them as such, but you just, when we drop all of those titles, you know, we just know that something common is being expressed, and we have our different forms. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Christina, and then Lee.
Yeah, I just want to quickly comment. When I heard the discussion between art and spirituality, and that remind me of Carl Jung, who's a psychologist, very interesting, connecting psychology with spirituality. And one of the things he said, art is, I'm not sure I paraphrase it correctly, because idea is that when you're doing art, it's a manifestation of both your conscious and unconscious. So I was thinking about just in general discussion, it depends on what the artists have, perhaps in the person's unconscious. And the person has that spiritual, as Vanessa mentioned, in the artist, in the person, I forgot his name, sorry, in the presentation today, how he was having this minimalism, sort of a Zen-like attitude, and with the material and access. And perhaps that's what's manifest in his work is his own spiritual beliefs. And so that's what I have to say. I don't necessarily think they are equivalent. It really depends on who the artist is, and whether the artist at that level of channeling or expressing spirituality. So yeah.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I think that interplay, you know, of conscious and subconscious in art is so fascinating. And I think it was around that time that, you know, people really got into that, like, you know, especially the surrealists. They were very, very interested in the power of the subconscious in relation to images, I think, just as in Jung's work. So yeah, and I'm sure that Duchamp, who we were talking about today, that he was, I'm sure he was influenced by this a great deal. They were all friends. They all hung out. They were all talking. Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Lee.
Hi. Yeah, so I was thinking that the reason that Duchamp did this kind of art is because he was able to express something that was totally sincere from him. And I think that's where the connection between art and spirituality can be made. It's something that's coming from, you're not intellectualizing it, you're not, you know, writing down 10,000 words about it. It's something that you're expressing from whatever is deep inside you. And this is what we're connecting with when we practice too, or trying to. You know, and so I think that's where the connection would be for this particular artist and the kind of work that seems to have a Zen-like, you know, effect on us. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know why when you were saying that, Lee, it just reminded me of when we were doing our Enzos. You just remember just that, wow, that was, you know, the simplicity of that gesture.
Yeah.
Just one such simple expression and a different, you know, different kind of repetition, I suppose, but it was a great experience.
It was.
Thank you.
Hi, Vanessa. This is Balaji.
Hi, Balaji.
Yeah. Yeah, I attended similar one meetup. They conducted Zen and art 5 years back. So they presented one idea like the square represent the samsara and the circle represent the nirvana state, like enlightenment state. In Japanese painting, they reflect that way, they said. Maybe the first picture we saw the wheel and the square bottom, probably representing the enlightenment in the top and the suffering part. I mean, kind of two divisions in that. And another in one of the San Francisco's Science Museum, they put the same toilet seat with a fountain as one of the display in a psychology department of the science exhibition. I took my son there. The kids, they drank from the toilet. It was clean one. They kept it there to see how people perceive the things in a different way. Kids are more open mind to accept things and try something new, but adults, they stay away from it because their mind is fixed things. They don't want to think it is a good thing to drink from that. So it is all psychology also involved in that. I mean, the toilet seat and the fountain in that. So that is my perspective, how we view that. It depends on if you have a fixed mind, it is like that. If you have an open mind, then all possibilities there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think I've had experience of maybe a similar fountain at the Exploratorium in San Francisco as well, where they had the urinal somewhere close to the door, and people were invited to come and drink from it. I'll admit that I could not do it. I could not do it. Just, my daughter just about did it. My husband thought it was hilarious, but I couldn't do it. Just could not drink from a urinal. Yeah. It's a great experiment. It's such an easy way of showing us how hardwired we are for silly things. Thanks, Balaji.
Umar?
Hey, Ma.
Sorry, let me unmute you really quick.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
How are you?
Okay, good. Hanging in there.
Thank you for the talk today. You jogged a lot of my memories too of avant-garde cinema. I used to take all kinds of classes of cinema, and one of the things was avant-garde cinema, and I studied Duchamp. And there's this movie, I think it is available on YouTube, 6 minutes long. It's called Anemic Cinema. And it's just worlds and circles and circles and worlds against different backgrounds. And it almost, what I remember from the class was, and it came back to me, was that his whole idea, as the teacher explained it, was to disorient the audience. Mm. And, you know, you guys were talking about how art and Zen are related. It's, so what the teacher did was, while he was projecting it, they stopped the movie and in the middle, and then let it go again. And it was almost like, you know, it was like taking a breath in between, taking a gap between two breaths, or having that feeling that your breath goes in and you hold it and then you let it go and then you take another breath. What I'm trying to say is there is a connection, but it's more about how Philip Glass represents art, that the silences are more important than the music before and after. So if you are aware of the silence and you are aware of what is coming next, expectations can be messed with, you know. Mm. So it's like saying banana pepper, you know, and it's like those two things do not go together. You know, but it can be very shocking. So I think what happens is when people get to a certain point of practicing their art, they can do whatever they want with it. And for them, it's the same thing. Everything's the same thing. It doesn't matter. But the way the spirituality is connected to art, personally, the way that I've been looking at it is that it really has to do with the space in between the brushstrokes.
Mm.
Or somebody who's, you know, while they're creating a piece of pottery, they will, I've seen people do this, while they'll be creating a piece of pottery, they'll put their hand, they'll move away, and then they'll put their hand into, or a finger into where there's supposed to be a hole, and we don't see it, but they know where the hole is supposed to be, and they put their finger right where the hole is supposed to be for them to form a spout or put in a handle or do something like that. And this is where art really connects with Zen. Is, I think it's the whole idea of being able to step back and see what can be done next. Without being taken away by excitement or being taken away by boredom, but being there in that moment and seeing, this is how I need to approach it. And that is, I think, comes from practicing art, that comes from sitting, that comes from looking at things very deeply. But I think personally, the Philip Glass sort of idea keeps on coming back to me. And you mentioned Man Ray. So Man Ray, Louis Buñuel, and Duchamp were in France at the same time, and all three of them made movies, short films, and they were very jarring. Man Ray's was Ballet Mécanique, Buñuel was Un Chien Andalou, and his was Anemic Cinema. And if you see them in one after the other, they can be very disorienting. But that was the whole idea, was to wake up the mind from just overthinking. And I think that's what Zen does for us, to wake us up from overthinking. My 2 cents. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you, Mark. It also just kind of makes me think of, the skill, that there's still so much skill in there, and it's a skill about the lightness of touch, or just the right amount of something, because it can also be overwhelming. Something can be too strong or too shocking, and then it just falls. I think to be able to, and I think that has so much to do with also, respect for your audience as well. And, the idea that I think you have to be, at least Duchamp, I think he was very gentle. I can't say the same for the Chien Andalou, but like, that was a rough film. But I think that, they're all, hey, they've all got legs, they've all lasted. We're sitting here talking about them 100 years later. So yeah, thank you. Elizabeth.
There we go.
Hi.
Thank you for a really great talk. I truly enjoyed it. I'm wondering what you think is going on now, and particularly what you think of Burning Man. Art can be so political. Is Burning Man a manifestation of the future?
I don't know so much about Burning Man, actually. I'd love to go. But from what I understand, so Burning Man, being an event in the desert, people kind of bring or make artworks. Like, there's a strong art theme there. And I suppose by definition, I'm sure it's very kind of open and democratic, and that sounds, so you're sort of talking about like art in a kind of open festival.
I'm kind of wondering what's happening today that's comparable to what Duchamp was doing.
Okay.
Breaking a mindset, forecasting the future. something political, maybe?
Hmm.
Hard question. Sorry about that.
It is. It's really hard. It's hard. It's hard because I'm trying to think of. I struggle to be. I struggle to be particularly inspired by much that I see in contemporary art, visual arts nowadays, and by that I mean, you know, the conversation of contemporary art, which was sort of the world that I was exposed to most in London. I mean, in London in the 90s and in the early 2000s when I was there, you know, the big conversation actually went back to the market of the art world. You know, this was a big conversation because at the time there was basically just one collector, Charles Saatchi, who's this advertising mogul with loads of money, who just decided to start pumping money into the art world. And, you know, basically whoever took his fancy or met his taste, you know, was sort of catapulted to fame in the UK. And that was a very strange thing to watch from the point of view of a student, because obviously the man had a particular taste. And, you know, he liked very punchy kind of one-liner sort of art that, that, you know, in some ways might have been a bit frivolous. I mean, I don't know, people are familiar with, like, Damien Hurst was one very famous artist who rose up out of Saatchi, and he was the man who would sort of put sharks in big formaldehyde tanks. But there was just, that all seemed to me very cynical. I sort of sail closer to writers, I think, nowadays, and I find a lot more vision and sincerity in novels and in poetry, because I think a lot of contemporary art has kind of gone down a bit of a rabbit hole,
right?
And I think, go ahead.
It seems to me from what you have shared tonight about Duchamp is that he anticipated the capitalization of art.
Yeah, well, it had already started, you know, like, I think that it had already started, and he could see where it was going. And he could see that, you know, that it was a very particular pressure is put on an artist once you're looking at the possibility of, you know, once you're thinking about galleries and collectors and people's taste.
Right.
You know, so you're moved in a particular, you're manipulated from the outset. I mean, it's very, very hard to produce freely in that atmosphere. You know, as opposed to your art, you know, decorating the inside of a chapel, which is paid for by I don't know, you know, there's been so many kind of different situations in which art's been made.
It seems like the capitalization is the opposite of Zen in some way.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it stymies, it prevents something from really being able to take its own course, or it takes it down a very particular kind of course.
About someone else's mindset,
Yeah, because then you're subject to taste, and you're subject to value, you know, and very random and imposed values, crazy prices, you know, that so inflated that they're worth on the one hand, and then you know, for the tiny percentage of people who can gather that kind of money for an artwork, and then the other 99.9%, you know, struggling. So yeah, it's tough. Elizabeth, if I'm inspired by something, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you.
I'll send it your way.
Great.
I'm sure something will come up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brenda?
Hi, Brenda.
Hi. Let me just unmute here. Hello, a lovely lecture. You know, I just as you were thinking, you're talking just now with your last question, I sort of started thinking about something that came up the other day when we were talking about Zen, actually, in terms of sort of the, I guess the, what they call it, dialectic of kind of, you know, if in some ways trying to keep the tradition very pure to its Zen roots in Japan or China, and then kind of this idea of, you know, wanting lots of people to practice it in the United States. And, you know, do you have to change it for that to happen? Or what does it mean? You know, maybe we can't, you know, not everybody, you know, is going to be able to practice it in the traditional Japanese way, both in terms of sitting, in terms of patience, or what have you. And so is it still Zen if it's not Japanese?
Right. Yeah. And it's a good question, and I think it's you know, obviously it's related with a lot of what we're talking about, because on the one hand you're talking about freedom. You know, we're talking about finding a kind of freedom that is not constrained by tradition. You know, something that can be very real in the moment. And on the other hand, we practice something here that has a form and that has developed a form over such a long time. And I think it's interesting for us, you know, to be in that space, like in between those two worlds. You know, that's sort of where we find ourselves, right, as Zen practitioners in 2020 in Western America. I think those two forces are at play, and I can't say, you know, I don't have an answer for you, because I see the value, and I see the strength of both. I can see how following a form, as long as one understands that it's a form, you know, it's the raft that's taking us to the other side. When it's seen for what it is, then you can very happily practice the form and be very free within it. At the same time, you know, those traditions and those forms must never become shackles, and they must never become what stops freedom from unfolding and what stops the truth being gotten at. So I think we're in a very unique place as far as that conversation goes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Travis?
Hi, Travis.
We keep trying to unmute you at the same time. I'm gonna let you do it.
Yeah.
There we go.
There. Thanks. Well, thank you for the talk and the parallels of modernism and Zen. We live in both movements, and it's great to see such a thoughtful exploration of that. You know, I think that modernism induces a kind of conceptual dysphoria that when you hear the phrase "the heron in the moonlight," you don't have that. You can picture it. Anyone can picture it if they've spent any amount of time in the moonlight. And when you see a heron, it's pretty special. It's not likely something you'll forget or confuse with another bird. And I think that the romance of the bicycle fork is it's a type of meta aesthetic. So what I mean by that is that it's beautiful because of the way in which the form of the fork follows the function of the bicycle rider. And I just saw a beautiful design that an engineer showed me just before this, where I was just really inspired and struck by the beauty of this design, this mechanical design that could go in and be in a surgical robotic instrument and work really well. And just before that, I had the time to go to the lake with my daughter and her friend, and they were paddling the stand-up paddleboard around. And my dog was there, and he was chasing the ball. And, you know, that sort of intimacy that was in that last work of Duchamp, you know, that's sort of like a snow globe, where this returning home, where he had to spend all of his time doing, thinking productive thoughts, like you said, the pathology of production. But to be able to take an afternoon with her and her friend and to really feel like they were having a good time and they weren't, you know, on screens, and they were like in nature, that natural geological, like, you know, environment that we should take from, but leave the source of, and leave it for the future. And that process of growth, the dust of the where he laid the painting down, that sort of those layers of accretion that are so welcome to our eyes, because we live so prevalently in an artificial environment. And so, you know, it just really strikes me that we can yes, inanimate objects expound the Dharma, but we can seek for the natural and the sublime as well, and that, you know, these artworks, these modern artworks, represent a kind of compression of experience that is in some ways intoxicating, but not a substitute for direct experience, and but yet inform and inspire it. It's just a kind of again, I think it's a meta aesthetic that is real, and yet where we experience it in our own lives is more real. It's like a launch pad, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, does that make any sense?
I was was holding on to you for that whole journey. I'm going back to especially what you were saying at just the beginning. Well, meta aesthetic. I've kind of thought about that too, in terms of objects, like what would I do? You know, where would I go with this? And, you know, a deconstructed bicycle, or a whole bottle rack but without its bottles, or, you know, this sort of decommissioned snow shovel. And, you know, again, this is 1917, like these are all like gleamy new things that you're looking at, like in the shops that have been designed. You know, these are like I don't want to say like Apple computer, but, you know, they're like
and they help people, right? Like a guy can get around town on a bicycle. It's elegant and wonderful.
You've got form and function coming in together in this most like incredible way, I think, in all of the objects. I think that's something he was getting at. The reason he loved coming to America was because of the industry here, you know, because of production and design. And he said, you know, America's got no art world back in the day, but you've got bridges and you've got plumbing. And, you know, like you've got skyscrapers, you know, this to him was like, he loved it, you know, he absolutely loved it. And he was really entranced by it, by these objects. And again, it's hard for us to go back to that point, you know, to go to the point where there being like a hardware store that sold these mass-produced items was still a relatively new thing, right? Like, you know, in that sense, the beauty of the enamel, of the white enamel. Yeah.
Really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Vanessa. I actually have a question, but it was inspired by a comment by Balaji. So he, when he saw the woman through the keyhole laying down, he said, "Liberty statue taking a rest," and
You said
that
what, sorry?
Liberty statue, Statue of Liberty taking a rest.
Taking a rest, okay.
And I was trying to think, oh, is that an interpretation? But there's actually a lot to that, I think, because she's, even though she's lying down, you can see her very prominently holding a torch, which is very peculiar. She's like chilling on the grass and then holding the torch.
Yeah.
So it's like, when does the Statue of Liberty get to rest, and what does that symbolically mean? And I think you said the name of the painting, or the, whatever you want to call it, the keyhole painting, was Given, which was Duchamp, French, right? French. And the Statue of Liberty was a gift, right, from the French. So I thought that was very fascinating. Some dots are connecting. So I'm not wanting to taint your the mystery of unknowing, which is also very wonderful, but I'm just curious if that interpretation of the Statue of Liberty taking a rest, if you have any thoughts about that, or what that could mean. I don't know exactly the year he painted it or what was going on. Was Liberty
it was up and running. Yeah. I mean, he made that it went up in 1969, so he would have started making it probably the end of the 40s, beginning of the 1950s. I mean, again, like, you know, he was just always very insistent that, you know, whatever his intention as an artist was pretty much irrelevant. The beauty of what happens is precisely what's happening when somebody looks at it and thinks of the Statue of Liberty, you know, or someone could think of their mother, you know, or someone could think of something absolutely awful that happened to them. I mean, there's so many different ways that, you know, something can be seen. And it's changing constantly, and there's you know, an object can be very powerful during a very specific period of time culturally, and then it can kind of lose its power, and why that happens is very mysterious too. I mean, he was not you know, considered, you know, outside of very like elite intellectual art circles, you know, nobody really ever heard of him, and to this day, you know, popularly he's not known, but within the world of art, he's like, you know, he is the godfather of the 20th century. I mean, that, you know, that's it, he's the man. So it's just the signifiers are just fluctuating, you know, depending on your point in space-time. So I think it's great. Statue of Liberty. That's another one. Yeah, the lady with the lamp.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Any last questions before we wrap up for tonight? Okay. Well, thank you, Vanessa, for a very thought-provoking and interesting talk. Great. Does anyone have any announcements? Teresa, do you want to announce about Saturday?
Yeah, I have to speak low voice because I have guests sleeping. But yeah, we have a workshop coming up this Saturday with Polar. I thank you, everyone who registered. Registration is closed now, but if you want to be put on the mailing list, you can email me, and I think it will be a wonderful workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa.
Oh, and next week, guest speaker. Let's see. Let me check.
I think it's me.
Oh, it's Bonnie. So Bonnie's our guest speaker next week.
Yeah. So I'll be speaking, and it'll be a surprise because I haven't decided quite yet the topic, but I'll be here. Any other announcements? Great. Is anyone here for the first time? Sam, have you been here before? No? Welcome. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Sam, and I just kind of stumbled upon this on a website a couple of days ago and was like, oh, this sounds interesting. So,
well, thank you for joining us. Anyone else here for the first time? Okay. Well, why don't we quickly go around and everyone say their names to Sam. I'm going to unmute everyone. So I'm Bonnie.
Dave.
Travis.
I'm Nick. This is Tony.
I have 2 tuxedo cats too.
I'm Les.
Vanessa.
Christina.
Balaji.
Sri.
Lee.
Umar.
I think so.
Also, this is Nogizaka. This is my other cat.
Oh, why? He's the shy one, huh?
He's the shy one, just since we're introducing everyone. So.
Thank you, everyone. And reminder that the session has been recorded. We record all the sessions and they go on YouTube. However, if you don't want your question or comment or image being in the video, please just let me know. You can send me a chat message right now or email me. And I can easily remove that for your privacy reasons. But other than that, we will post this on YouTube and you can feel free to share. And I'm now gonna unmute everyone. You can stay on if you want to hang out a little bit, or you can take off. We are officially done for the evening. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Vanessa.